Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 109, Horodło and Constance. Following the disastrous loss at Tannenburg, Heinrich von Plauen became the new Grand Master of the Teutonic Order. He wanted one thing, revenge, and started making plans for war immediately. He had hopes of one last crusade and appealed to the Pope, claiming again that Jogaila's conversion was a trick to secure the throne, and that he had brought pagans, schismatics, and infidels to fight true Catholics at Tannenburg. But the ground had shifted. The order found itself somewhat isolated. Former staunch supporter Sigismund of Luxembourg had a new pet project, a general council of the Church to end the East-West schism in the face of the growing Ottoman threat. That meant uniting the Catholic kings and princes of Europe, and that meant Poland now carried more weight than the order. This was especially true as Jogaila was openly hostile to Sigismund and fomented opposition to him among the princes of the Holy Roman Empire. Therefore, he was looking for an opportunity to win Jogaila over, and serving as a mediator between Poland and the Order was just such an opportunity. Jogaila took him up on his offer, and negotiations opened in Buda in 1412 and continued in Kaunas in 1413. The talks went beyond just a peace settlement and included territorial claims by all the parties. The order came with a strong case, asserting that Samogitia's continuing adherence to paganism justified its rule under its crusading mission, and that the Salin Agreement, ratified by Vytautas and Jogaila, had ceded the region to them. The union negotiators presented an argument that might have been surprising to anyone familiar with the situation. They claimed that the people of Samogitia were free, and therefore could only voluntarily accept someone's rule. They had accepted the joint lordship of Vytautas and Jogaila, and the cousins did not have the right to cede their land without Samogitian consent. If the Samogitians did not wish to be ruled by Vytautas and Jogaila, it was up to them to choose another prince. Rather than simply being a cunning negotiation stance, some historians argued that this argument reflected how the cousins were thinking about the development of the union. The talks dragged on and ended up going nowhere, but while they were happening, the order removed Plauen, finding him just too much of a warmonger, replaced him with Michael Kookmeister von Sternberg, and the cousins concluded a new treaty at Horodło in southeast Poland on 2nd of October 1413. This treaty consisted of 3 documents, the first of which was issued jointly and settled their titles. Vytautas at last officially became the Grand Duke of Lithuania and received equal status with Jogaila as the lord and inheritor of the Ruthenian lands. By this point, Vytautas had been calling himself Grand Duke for 2 decades, but Jogaila had not previously recognized his right to do so. The change in status was a clear reflection of how they had moved on from rivalry to cooperation. The main treaty began by emphasizing how the Union had enabled Lithuania to join the Catholic world and the benefits of Christianity. It then addressed the applicare issue, stating that Jogaila's Lithuanian and Ruthenian lands had indeed been incorporated into Poland, and that they were now being reincorporated. Here, the treaty uses a whole series of synonyms: incorporamus, invisceramus, appropriamus, coniungimus, adiungimus, confederamus et perpetue annectimus, presumably to avoid anyone asking again, yes, but what do you mean by applicare? Or maybe as misdirection, since many scholars argue that the subsequent clauses show that Lithuania was not, in fact, incorporated into Poland. For the first time in these treaties, the election of a new Grand Duke after Vytautas' death is covered. The treaty states that the Lithuanian barons and nobles should only choose a successor agreed with Jogaila or his successors and the prelates of barons of Poland. Likewise, should Jogaila die without an heir, Poland would only elect an heir with the knowledge and consent of Vytautas and the Lithuanian barons and nobles. Then new offices of Palatine and Castellan were established for Vilnius and Trakai, as well as wherever else the need arose. These were based on the Polish model and were a key step towards creating an institutionalized governing structure, rather than just the personalized rule of the Grand Duke. This is often seen as effectively acknowledging the existence of a separate Lithuanian state. It would only need a governing structure if it existed, after all. Thus, the argument goes, the claim of incorporation was a tool to use against the order, a public demonstration to counter the order's claims that Poland and Lithuania were separate entities. Even some Polish historians who argued that the previous agreements had incorporated Lithuania agree that it now became independent. More nationalist Lithuanian scholars treat Lithuania as an independent state from 1413, and Hrushevsky and other Ukrainian historians also go along with this view. Robert Frost, however, does not. He argues that the frequency and way the treaty is cited in contemporary disputes between Poland and Lithuania, as well as by contemporary writers like Długosz, shows that they had a very different view. This difference, he argues, comes down to a difference in worldview that we often lose when we're looking back from modern times. The creation of an independent Lithuanian state is a matter of great concern for later historians, especially 20th and 21st century historians who have been forced by events to defend Lithuania's right to exist. But the modern nation-state as a concept meant nothing in the 15th century, and they were rather talking about peoples. As Długosz, a firm believer in Lithuanian incorporation, put it, the populos Polonicus cum Lituanicus et Samagiticus. The terms of the agreement were debated by the Lithuanian and Polish nobility separately before these two communities agreed to support it. The Lithuanian church and boyars were granted the same rights as their Polish counterparts: the right to pass their allodial estates to their heirs, the right to secure tenure of their hereditary lands, and the rights of wives and daughters to inherit a portion. Catholic nobles were released from the obligation to work on fortress construction and repairs. Both Polish and Lithuanian nobles swore oaths to both Jogaila and Vytautas, with it being stated that loyalty was owed in exchange for the rights and privileges that they had been granted. Provision was made for future assemblies to discuss their common interests, to be held in border towns such as Lublin. One of the most interesting clauses, which sounds quite strange from a modern perspective, required Vytautas to select 47 families from the Lithuanian boyars, who were to be adopted by 47 Polish Szlachta families. From then on, they would be part of the heraldic clans of those families, and treated as brothers. Historians have debated the intent of this provision. Some have seen it as another attempt by the Poles to Polonize the Lithuanian ruling class. Others have argued that it had little effect beyond some Lithuanian families adopting a Polish coat of arms. Frost sees it as another illustration of the agreement's intention to create a union of two communities, to build on the cooperation that had led to the success at Tannenburg, and ensure that it continued after the deaths of Jogaila and Vytautas. Paweł Wojtkowicz, a lecturer in law and later rector of Krakow University, described it as follows, quote, Jogaila and Vytautas, after they had arranged that Lithuania with all its lands, lordships, and everything that belonged to it, with the consent of the people and the said princes, should be united, joined, and incorporated into the Kingdom of Poland in perpetuity, in such way that the whole peoples of Lithuania and Poland should remain together in the said kingdom, as if they formed one body, one complete dominion or kingdom. End quote. The clauses of the agreement end by explaining that the agreement is talking about the Corona Regni, the community of the kingdom, rather than the regnum, the crown, showing that, as Wojtkowicz states, the emphasis was union and unity of the peoples, with equal rights for Poles and Lithuanians, not incorporation of Lithuania as a subordinate or the creation of a separate Lithuanian state. The agreement was a message to the international Catholic community, stating that Poland and Lithuania were united by their own unanimous consent, with, as it stated, the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. For the Poles, it was intended to demonstrate that the Greva Agreement had been practically realized, and that Poland and Lithuania were now indeed united. And for the Lithuanians, it showed that Jogaila and Vytautas were working together in a political union that was now based on law, not simply ad hoc arrangements embodied in the person of the ruler. For Vytautas, the agreement was acceptable because of those measures that it implemented to establish the government of Lithuania. The creation of the Palatinates of Vilnius and Trakai, which covered most of Lithuania proper, established that Lithuania was part of the political community, equal to the Polish regions, rather than an annexed province, and the provisions on the election of the next Grand Duke allowed Vytautas to plan for his succession. The Horodło agreement, therefore created the framework for the next 150 years of Polish and Lithuanian relations. Time will show that the attempts to institutionalize the office of the Grand Duke and provide rules for the succession were inadequate, but there was one other factor that will create problems. The rights under the Horodło Agreement, as we've heard, were granted to Catholic boyars of Lithuanian descent. What did that mean for Jogaila and Vytautas Orthodox Ruthenian subjects? They were not mentioned in the agreement, and neither were the Ruthenian lands. The political community was the community of Lithuania, centered on the new Palatinates of Vilnius and Trakai, and restricted to Catholics. The Ruthenian boyars, who had sworn their approval of Kreva, were not asked to swear to Horodło. Gediminid Lithuania had been built on tolerance, but now the Orthodox had been relegated to a second class. The emphasis on the consent of the peoples was not just about Jogaila and Vytautas looking for legitimacy. They had solid dynastic claims. It was about countering the order in the appeals to the Pope that would be litigated over the next few years at the Council of Constance. The Council of Constance, held in Germany from 1414 to 1418, was primarily intended to solve the Western Schism, the situation where the Catholic Church had ended up with two popes, one in Rome and one in Avignon. It also dealt with other issues that were particularly critical to the Holy Roman Empire, namely Jan Hus, a Czech forerunner of Protestantism, and the conflict between Poland and Lithuania, and the Order of the Teutonic Knights. Besides the question of crusading, as I mentioned, there were the issues of Samogitia, which Vytautas had ceded to the order, and Pomerelia, which Poland had ceded to the order in perpetuity in 1343. As already noted, the agreements under which these regions had been ceded gave the order very strong claims. Poland and Lithuania were now arguing against those agreements on the basis that princes did not have any right in natural law to alienate any part of their realms without the consent of those affected. This was quite a novel position at the time, and from our perspective, many of the Polish and Lithuanian arguments seem quite reasonable and even modern, while the order and their supporters come off as, well, unhinged is probably not too strong a term. We need to avoid presentism, judging people in the past by the standards of our time instead of their own, but when Johannes of Falkenberg, a Dominican theologian in the order's delegation, argued that, quote, "The emperor has the right to slay even peaceful infidels simply because they are pagans. The Poles deserve death for defending infidels and should be exterminated even more than the infidels. They should be deprived of their sovereignty and reduced to slavery." End quote. It's fair for us to ask whether contemporaries really saw this kind of rhetoric as justified. Events at the conference proved that they did not. The Polish delegation was well educated at Krakow University, Prague and Rome. Stanislav of Skarbimierz rector of the university and one of the drafters of the Vilnius-Radom Agreement, had written a sermon in 1410 entitled On Just Wars. It used canon and natural law to argue that pagans had a right to have and defend their own state, and that Christians were allowed to defend them if other Christians attacked them unjustly. Another rector that I already mentioned, Pavel Wojtkowicz, delivered a treatise to the Council of Constance, the treatise on the power of the Pope and the Emperor respecting infidels. This treatise was essentially an attack on the entire existence of the order. Wojtkowicz recapped its history as a tale of atrocities against Prussians and Lithuanians, and then attacked the legal basis for their actions given to them by various popes and emperors. He discussed the legal position of Jews and Muslims in Christian states, which, as you might have noticed in previous episodes, was much better in Poland and Lithuania than other parts of Europe. He used the Bible to argue that Christians were not entitled to mistreat infidels living among them if they accepted the laws of the Christian community in which they lived. Pagans, he said, just like Christians, were rational beings created by God and could not be dispossessed or expelled from their homes without good cause. Pagans had a natural right to their own state, and if they rejected the power of the emperor or other princes, then attacking them was contrary to natural law and God's will. Wojtkowicz contrasted the Reconquista, in which the Spanish had fought Muslims to recover what had been Christian territory, with the Order's exterminatory attacks on the peaceful pagans of Lithuania and Samogitiya. Natural law gave peaceful pagans the right to defend themselves against such unjust attacks. Lastly, he argued, it was wrong to convert infidels to Christianity by force. As rational beings created by God with freedom of conscience, they had to choose to believe of their own free will. This was one of the first European attempts to defend the right of non-Christians to live in peace and defend themselves, with arguments that would later be elaborated in international law. We should not overestimate the Polish commitment to liberty. Although they may have believed in the general direction of the arguments they presented, their main aim was to beat the order, not to advocate liberty for all. Poland and Lithuania remained happy with serfdom and continued to have an ambivalent attitude to slavery. But despite this, the articulation of the idea that everyone has the right to live in peace was an important step forward. In February 1416, a delegation of 60 Samogitian converts arrived in Constance to support the Polish and Lithuanian arguments. Jogaila and Vytautas had sailed down the Niemen and personally appealed to leading Samogitians, resulting in their voluntary conversion. Now they had come to show that this approach was more effective than anything the Order had done. This was all a bit of a PR stunt. The visit by Jogaila and Vytautas had been short, and the Christianization of Samogitiya was a slow process, but it was another blow against the Order. In February 1416, Poland and Lithuania presented the Propositio Samatirum. This document contained 40 points, setting out a detailed comparison of Jogaila and Vytautas' peaceful evangelization of Samogitiya and the Order's violence and failure to Christianize the population. It described how Vytautas had cut down the sacred groves, and Polish priests and missionaries had brought word to villages. The success of Christianization in Lithuania was held up as a model for what would be accomplished in Samogitiya. The Polish delegation carried the day. They had finally persuaded the majority of members of the council. In 1417, the council established a new bishopric at Medininkai. Parishes would start appearing in Samogitiya, led by Lithuanian priests trained in Poland. Johannes Falkenberg produced a rebuttal to the treatise, essentially calling for genocide of the Poles and calling Jogaila a mad dog unfit to be king. This time he was so extreme that the order was forced to disown and imprison him. The Polish victory at Constance was far from total. The order will try to hang on for another century with regular outbreaks of fighting, but it does mark the order finally ceasing to be a genuine threat in the Baltic. The end of crusading and the loss of the international support that had kept it going so long. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.